Hello. The next lecture in this MOOC on the Renaissance and Shakespeare is going to be delivered by Professor Shishendu Chakraborty of the Department of English, University of Delhi. Professor Chakraborty is going to be talking about Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. He is going to talk about the dreamlike quality of the play, the various dreams that the various characters seem to experience. He is going to relate this to notions of Neo-Platonism and make a beautiful, insightful point about how there can be a sense of love without power or control that finds expression in the dreamlike quality of the play.
One of the first things that we need to take into account in Shakespearean comedy is that there are many sources that can be identified, as in the tragedies, but Shakespeare really had no pattern or paradigm as he had in tragedy, Greek or Senecan or other forms. There were some precursors, of course, Green and Lilly, and the poetry and romances. But in this sense, we should remember that Shakespearean comedy is centered on love. I've titled this lecture, The Idea of Dream in Midsummer Night's Dream. What is interesting is that many of the characters in the play undergo the experience of dream. But why is the play called A Midsummer Night's Dream? Virtually everybody has a dream, and yet it is not in the plural but in the singular. To put it very simply, why is the play called A Midsummer Night's Dream? So I want to draw your attention to the dreamlike quality, which many people have also drawn attention to, of the play, and in some of Shakespeare's comedies, to create kind of dreamlike world. This world is created as we enter from Athens into the forest among the world of fairies. But this is Shakespeare's ambivalence and a problem that we must challenge, a question or encounter rather. It is that the world of fairies seems to be almost exactly the same as the world of human beings. The play begins with a quarrel between father and daughter over choosing husband. And the first line, when the fairy, queen and king meet, is ill met by moonlight. There is a quarrel. There is a desire for control. So Oberon wants to control Titania in the fairyland, just as the idea of control implied in Theseus's warlike victory over Hippolyta. She is a war prize. And the father, Aegeus's attempt to control the daughter, Hermia. Because Hermia does not listen to her father's dictates. But this is the question, why is this movement away? They run away from Athens, from the world of law, into apparently a magic world. But when we enter that world, we find that it is in many ways same. The problems are the same, it seems. So this dreamlike world is not a pure world of pure fantasy. But it has to be seen in terms of certain ideas in the Renaissance, particularly the product of the Neo-Platonic Academy. We'll discuss this in a minute, but in which an attempt is made to answer two major challenges made by Plato against art. One is that art has no truth in it. Everybody knows from Republic Book 10. The second is from Republic Book 3, particularly, and the other one, two books, is that art arouses passions. And so the control of reason over passions, which is an axiom almost for Plato, is disturbed when we go to see a play. So the playwright or the artist is either committed to poems about heroes and gods, worship, otherwise honored, garlanded, respected, and thrown out of the so-called Republic of Plato. Now, to answer this charge, we find the first point about truth. We find here that the idea came from Platonic Academy in the following way. We have to very briefly put it, actually, because this is not a lecture on Neo-Platonism. But before the Academy, on the whole, the Neoplatonic theory of the cosmos involved a kind of chain of being, a continuous graduated cosmos. But when, with the recovery of classical values and classical texts in the Renaissance, people read Plato in the original, Platonic Academy, particularly in Florence, and commentaries were being written on Plato on the basis of the original Greek text. They discovered that Plato argued not in favor of a continuous chain, but an unbridgeable gulf always between the finite and the infinite, between the actual and the ideal. To put it very briefly, what the Platonic Academy did was to go back to the original texts of Plato in Greek and discover that instead of the medieval Neoplatonic notion of a continuous graduated cosmos, the cosmos for Plato was always in two parts, defined by mutual negation, incommensurable with each other. Finite and infinite, ideal, actual. Terminology has been expanded infinitely here also. But this is where the problem is, because in previous, earlier Neoplatonism, through the centuries, there was a continuous chain. Now there is an unbridgeable gulf between the finite and the infinite. What Ficino did, particularly as a leader, of course as a team, was to construct the notion of an eros. This is what is called the erotic cosmology. So, because there is separation, he argued, chorismos, between the finite or the actual and the infinite or the ideal, because of the separation, there is participation or methexis. How? By a hankering of the finite for union with higher forms of life, with infinite. The finite is defined in dynamic terms, always in a state of movement towards a union with the infinite, but by definition that union will never be possible because there is always an unbridgeable gulf. In Ficino's argument, let's come to the point very quickly because this is not a lecture on Neoplatonism, is that this works in the world of cosmos. We forget about that because we are now in the scientific world. But man is one of these links between the higher and the lower world. At once, at the highest point, linked to the lowest point. And inside man, of course, also this dichotomy of spirit and flesh. These correspond, according to Ficino, to form and content in art. Art, also for him, occupies a middle space, an intermediary space. One of the sources, of course, is symposium. There is no doubt about that, and there is no time here to talk about that immediately. But the idea is to define the ontology of art. Where does art, what kind of space does art occupy? It is neither actual nor is it ideal. And therefore Plato's argument that it has nothing to do with truth. But the Platonic Academy argued that the truth can only be accessed, acquired, approximated to by the visible, sensible, phenomenal world, the sensuous. So therefore the defense of art, or to use Shakespeare's constant use of that contrast, substance and shadow. But what I had said earlier also is that these are to be found in the poetry, sonnet sequences, romances, Sidney, Spenser in particular. But in theatre, there are hardly any precursors of the kind, let us say, we have in tragedy. I don't mean immediately Elizabethan precursors, but the great models of Greece and Rome, etc., we don't have. Classical comedy is critical, is punitive, is full of ridicule, is basically centered upon the exposure of the hypocrisies or vices or follies of the protagonist. Here something else is being done with love at the center. So the question of truth has, I have tried to answer very briefly here, that truth can only be approximated to. And therefore art is that approximation. And that constitutes the Renaissance theory of style. The style is a constant movement towards the truth. They often refer to the theory of the unfinished, or as Montaigne later said, the essay, an attempt. Every attempt must be followed by another attempt. And the opposition is not now between truth and false, but between truth and another truth, and another truth, and another truth, unending, inclusive extension, as it were. This is important if we go back to one or two dates. Midsummer Night's Dream was produced 1595-96, in the same year as Romeo and Juliet was. And it gives us some understanding of Shakespeare's mind if we see that the Romeo and Juliet story, intense love of very young lovers, parental opposition of serious kind, and then death, tragic death because of that. That story is farcically travestied in Midsummer Night's Dream, in the Pyramus Thisbe performance, which is rehearsed and planned and put up for the wedding of Theseus by the artisans, the rude mechanicals as they are called. So this is the kind of mind of Shakespeare. In the same year, he is writing Romeo and Juliet, where this love is seen its great and intense tragic dimensions. At the same time, same year, he is writing a play in which the same story is turned into a travesty. This is what I meant by saying truth versus truth. There is one way of looking at life, there is yet another way of looking at life. It is often compared to perspective. So one perspective to another perspective to another perspective, and thus unending and therefore unfinished. So the territory occupied by art is indeterminate, it's dreamlike, not in the modern sense so much, but as a territory which is neither actual nor ideal. And therefore the similarity that when we enter the so-called dreamland, the woodland, etc., even in As You Like It, various other places one may make examples of, we enter into a different world, but at the same time a similar world. Very confusing sometimes. Students find that from the patriarchal kind of problem with which the play begins, Midsummer Night's Dream, we enter into patriarchy, into the fairyland. So this is the answer, I think, to Plato's problem about the truth of art. The second problem, of course, is that art arouses passions, and so when you go out to the theatre and come out of it, your balance and equilibrium has all been lost. This is, of course, answered by Aristotle. Mind you, when Aristotle is answering this, he is operating within the concepts and categories of Plato. He shares it. That he does not say passions should take over, not like D.H. Lawrence, for instance. But reason controlling passions, of course. But for him, the arousal, as chapter 6, Poetics, the arousal of these emotions, in this case he's talking about tragedy, of course, pity and fear, the arousal enables the dramatist to accomplish catharsis of such emotions, wherewith, he says, the arousal of pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish the catharsis of such emotions. For the arousal is in the audience knows, not in an actual world or nor in an ideal, invisible, intelligible world merely. But this is a world which is somewhat controlled by the form of art, dance, music, rhythm, etc. It is like sufficiently like life and sufficiently unlike life. So this is the first point that needs to be made about Midsummer Night's Dream, as why a Midsummer Night's Dream when there are so many people dreaming. It's because of the dreamlike quality. Many people have talked about this, that this is like, it's like a symphony, it's like a musical symphony, Granville Barker says, and it was put to music by Purcell, a musician of his time, Shakespeare's time. Later, by no less a person than Mendelssohn, lends itself to a kind of operatic quality, stylized form. Yes, we know that. But we must go back to the question of ambivalence. Many editors, including Harold Brooks, they've noted that moonlight is mentioned 28 times in the play. But there are so many meanings to the moonlight, so many ways of looking at moonlight. The marriage of Theseus and Hippolyta going to take place in 4 days or time, whatever, I'm forgetting exactly 3 or 4 days time, the new moon. Lysander is accused of wooing Hermia by moonlight. Oberon and Titania, however, quarrel by moonlight. The rude mechanicals, that is the artisans, Bottom and company, they rehearse their plays by moonlight, where moonlight is light itself, nothing else. It's kind of light, but simply that. The moon is a symbol of chastity, virginity. It is a symbol of fertility. In the play throughout, there is that sense of. So these oppositions, truth, one truth versus another truth, this seems to be closer to Shakespeare's ambivalent vision of reality. And that is not, I'm not saying that this is very peculiar, idiosyncratic to Shakespeare, but this is, I think, the Renaissance notion of as in sculpture, they use the concept of contrapposto, the sonnet, the volta, the turnaround, this kind of contrasting concepts of reality, gradually building up a totality which is unending and therefore in that sense unfinished, like the form of man, similarly the form of art. Now, the question is, why does this, now we come to the question of why. Why does Shakespeare use this kind of, let us take this play a little more specifically, entry into the fairyland, and yet show it then to be infected, if I may say so, with the same kind of problems and contaminated by the same kinds of power relations in equations. There are references to rape, violence, etc. And of course the idea of domination rules the world. So where have we entered? We have entered from Athens into a magic world. This magic world has sometimes, of course, been seen naturally in very psychological terms, Freudian terms, understandably. But I think it has sometimes been overdone, especially in the titanium-bottom relationship. Its sheer absurdity has been made too somber, according to my judgment. But we enter into this world which is supposed to be different and yet similar in many ways. So what kind of a world is this that we enter into? This is where we are made to discover ourselves. We are released and emancipated from the pressures of pragmatic everyday life into recognizing certain kinds of forces that we were not aware of within us. For instance, and of course this is a Shakespearean theme, I'm not saying that this is peculiar to this play, the most intimate of friends, brothers or sisters, it's where they fall apart suddenly in great hatred. You know the story of Tempest. You know the story of As You Like It, the two brothers, Orlando, Oliver, and then Duke brothers also. Everywhere, people who are very close to each other suddenly express hatred, and there is no reason given for that. As here, for instance, Hermione and her friend Helena. They were the closest of friends. Like a double cherry, like two cherries on the same stem, etc., etc. There are various examples given. And they themselves say, Helena says, we grew up together, we learned everything together, we were inseparable. Why has this come? It is this question that is important. Sudden onset of hatred, jealousy, etc. This can be explained at one level in the play because of the confusions created by the use of magic by Puck. But it happens too often in Shakespearean comedy, I think, to suggest, to my mind, a certain inscrutability, irrationality, and inexplicability which renders us vulnerable to the world of passions. This meaning of passions is very close to the modern use still of the word passive, holding us like passive victims in its clutches. That's what passion is. So people say they go back to Athens, these courtiers, courtly lovers, and nothing has changed in Athens. Of course nothing has changed. But a certain kind of self-knowledge has been acquired by the characters. And in that sense, the magic potion is a metaphor. It's fun. I'm not denying the fairy aspect and the confusions created because of that. Primarily a metaphor of the vulnerability to the world of passion, the sudden onset and inexplicable onset of hatred, for instance. And then later, Theseus and others comment upon the lovers sleeping close by each other. It says, so close to each other, hatred and love suddenly brought back together. How? Well, you will say magic. But magic is a comment upon the inexplicability in the human affairs. And there is an element of irrationality in Helena's love particularly. Helena's love for Demetrius, who is a bit of a philanderer. There is a triangle in the beginning, so to speak. Hermia wants her husband, Lysander as her husband, against her father's wishes. Again, not an uncommon motive in Shakespeare. And those of you who read Othello will of course know the best example. And that is to some extent endorsed by the king. So patriarchal endorsement. Helena, on the other hand, is still in love with Demetrius. And Demetrius seems to be playing with her passion because he's a philanderer, it seems. He was in love with Helena, supposedly, and now he wants Hermia. But when the lovers, that is Lysander and Hermia, are given the choice, Hermia is given the choice, either marry according to the father's wishes or face banishment, death, or banishment to the nunnery. So they decide to go away from Athens to escape from Athenian law. But before going, they inform Helena, out of friendship. Hermia says that they are going to beyond the Athenian, the arm of Athenian law in order to get married or whatever. And Helena says, alone, that she would also like to go there, informing Demetrius before going there. So that she says she wants to enrich her pain. There's a strange psychological element here, almost bordering upon the masochistic. And she is a very intelligent girl in the whole play. But she says that I prefer to be your spaniel, Demetrius. Treat me like your dog, but I do not mind. She changes later, it's true. But it's so different from the independence of Hermia, it seems. Again, Plato. Plato in the Symposium seems to suggest that love begins with love of the human body, and gradually, scala amoris, like a ladder of love, you rise to love of philosophy and the state and whatever. A rational account. And then he perhaps realized that this was too rational. And so in the Phaedrus we have soul being described as a charioteer with two horses, one dark and one white. And the dark wants to possess the object of beauty at once. That's a psychological metaphor, of course. And it has to be tortured, whipped, etc. in order to bring into obedience. But the charioteer cannot make its journey towards truth and beauty and goodness without the two horses. You need both these horses. So I'm not saying that Helena and Hermia correspond to the two horses, but that there is an irrational and darker element in love. That this is one of the most lyrical comedies, people say. Many people have said that, many critics. But even within that there is parental oppression, there is the darkness of Helena's love, and then the discovery of where does it come from? Helena and Hermia fall apart. And we discover that Hermia is capable of scratching with her nails the eyes of Helena. This is violence inside the forest. Now if you go back to the idea of dream, you will see that everybody has dreams, and they say strange dreams we have had. And in the fourth act, they seem to wake up. Demetrius and others say they seem like far away mountains, etc. But it seems that we have just woken from a dream. Oberon says when she, that is Titania, when she is given the right potion, etc., she will also wake from her dream. Yes. So we have said a fair amount about the dream world in terms of truth. One or two things more just about the question of passions. And the third book of the Republic, which some people don't read, and the effect, as I said, go to the theatre, emotions are aroused, and you come out an unbalanced person. So, very dangerous. In the Republic, Plato finds this very dangerous. The effect, unsettling, reasons control over passions, which is almost an axiom for it. Aristotle works, as I said, within this tradition, but for him, going into the theatre and experiencing, as his chapter 6 says, the arousal of emotions, but within an environment which we call artistic form. So this is the definition which I come. Neither, why dream-like? Because this is not the actual world, but you go to the play, you know its relationship, you recognize its relationship to the actual world clearly. Nor is it the ideal world we know, but it is aspiring to that, approximating to that. So therefore style as conflict, style as struggling towards mastery of language. This is very common, well known, etc. But Aristotle says that the arousal of this in the theatre, because of the mastery which is implicit in the notion of poetic form, and that is a mastery of rhyme, rhythm, etc., 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 music, dance in Greek theatre. Here, for instance, a lot of dancing, and all this leads to the catharsis of such emotions. Sometimes students tend to neglect the first part, arousal of emotion. Arousal of the emotion important, but wherewith to accomplish the catharsis of such emotions. So that Aristotle is saying, from within the Platonic tradition in some ways, that when you come out of the theatre, actually you are a more balanced person, more aware of the way in which passions and reason are related. So your passiveness, your passions do not hold you in its clutch passions. To hold in that clutches like a prey as much as before you were. So the theatre has a kind of therapeutic effect. As a kind of polemical footnote, one would say that F.L. Lucas used to say long ago that the theatre is not a hospital, purgation of such emotions. But in this view, I'm saying the theatre is like a hospital actually. You go there and it is like a therapeutic effect for the Greeks. For your control, your understanding of the world, the passions, if you want to call it the subconscious. I have no problem with that. Using the older language I am, but understanding of that is enough. So when they go back, the characters, it is, I think, a little foolish to expect that Athens has changed and Athenian law has changed. But the consciousness has to some extent been subtly affected. And this knowledge is very important. To digress for a moment, there are many dialogues in Mahabharata between Yudhishthira and Dharma. And in one of these dialogues, Dharma says, because Kunti, Yudhishthira's mother, Pandava's mother, was supposed to be Ananta Yovana, was everlasting youth, more beautiful. She said, do you not feel lustful towards your mother, attracted, desire? And Yudhishthira says, yes, I do, and that is why I do not submit to it. So knowledge of that kind, where it enables you to a certain kind of possibility of self-mastery. This is the important point that one needs to make here. Now, we need to bring in also the role of the common people in all Shakespeare actually, but in this play particularly, the way there is a royal wedding But in it, for it, and in fact that is chosen by Theseus, this play is to be put up. Pyramus and Thisbe, tragic story called Lamentable Comedy, and of course farcically presented. Everybody knows that affair. But it is their life and their perception which is contrasted with the courtly kind of love tradition. I wouldn't call it courtly love really, but upper class love, let us say. The lovers are all upper class, while this, and therefore for them moonlight means something else, and so on. But for these people, common people, there is a different kind of life. And the two are brought side by side, typically always. First scene and the second scene itself, we have the rude mechanicals, people who work with their hands, artisans. They are rehearsing for the play. And they know nothing about really the play, the aesthetics, etc., lamentable comedy, and so on. But it is a view which is important to pick up later, the view of the common man. It is present in tragedy, but in a different form. Where even a play like, say, King Lear, where Lear, storm, heat scene, etc., discovers his common humanity. One can go on giving examples. But the presence is a contrast, but it's an interesting contrast. Because the upper class lovers are making fun of them. Even Puck says. But if you notice what Puck says about the folly of foolish mortals, inclusive, not just these rude mechanicals. So, when they put up the performance in the end, we have the familiar Shakespearean pattern where we are sitting in the audience and Bottom and company are putting up Pyramus and Thisbe, the episode, the story. And there is another level of audience, that is the courtiers, etc., who are sitting with Theseus watching the play. And they are making fair amount of snide comments upon these plays and the way they are doing, but not realizing that their falling in love and what episodes through which they go may be subjected to that perspective. So there is a kind of boomerang, as it were. The satirical jibes extended towards the common people, boomerangs to some extent back to these courtiers and their way of life and the question there. So this is very important, the presence of a common humdrum point of view of life. This is what sustains us. Use of language, one needs to make a point here, using prose of course, especially when the rude mechanicals are present, using fairly exalted blank verse, as Theseus comes and announces the date of his marriage or whatever discussions. And sometimes rhymed couplets, sticomethea as we say. In the opening, after the people leave, it begins with virtually a quarrel. As I'm repeatedly saying, Hermia comes, he wants to marry Lysander, father does not. Father chooses Demetrius. No reason is given. And Aegeus says, I'm sorry, that I have right, the right over you, parental right, and supported by Theseus. So we begin with that kind of quarrel. But as we proceed, of course they're going into the fairyland and as I said, they discover that the problems are the same because their husband and wife are quarreling over possession of the Indian child, the famous example. But the point about commonness is important because bottom has a dream. Everybody has a dream. Bottom is actually one who comes and says, I had a strange dream. It had no bottom in it. But he is unable to relate the dream. What the dream is, he is unable to relate. Now, critics are perfectly free to see this in terms of complicated modern psychology. Why not? That there are very disturbing and strange things he saw. I think though it runs against the grain of the play, but anyway, it was, but I'm suggesting something else. I'm suggesting that the folly is very important. Here we have the wisdom of folly. In tragedy, the classic case is of Oedipus, where, for instance, everybody forbids him to find out about the past, including Jocasta, not only the prophet Tiresias, etc., but he wants to find out the past. Even though he knows, I think he senses that this might lead to self-destruction. The truth at any cost. So this is one way of looking at reality. Socratic phrase, remember, which is often used now like GK, now general knowledge, that unexamined life is not worth living. But humankind cannot bear too much reality. That's also true, if I may quote from Eliot. And for common men, particularly, if not others also, there is a kind of need for illusion at a certain stage. Friendship cannot begin. And I'm thinking partly of Erasmus' praise of folly, of course. Love cannot begin. Affection cannot begin without a measure of illusion. You think your mother is the best person in the world. That is the first step to your love for your mother, or your husband, or your friend, whatever. And this is really, in one sense, a kind of wisdom which sustains us. So should we see Broughton's dream and his inability to describe it in terms of this wisdom of folly, which enables us to live on the surface of life, with the knowledge that underneath there is a darkness. There are entanglements, there are dangerous things underneath. Comedy in that sense is concerned with survival. We survive. We don't rush to or move to truth at the cost of self-destruction, which is a great tragic paradigm, of course. But there is another paradigm which is of the grave diggers, of the common people, of the beggars, etc. And think of Shakespeare's plays actually, and common people, let's say in the history plays. And the life they spend, they carry on, it carries on. With the knowledge that if art offers us a radiant surface, which enables us to see inside the darkness, if there is no clarity on the surface, the darkness cannot be made visible. I'm thinking of Swift's metaphor here, digressively, says that a well which has no water and is filled with earth seems to be very profound and deep, it's dark, but actually there's nothing inside it. Or one which has water, clear water, you can see to the bottom. So it brings what is unconscious up to the surface. Similarly, this radiant surface is also the radiant surface of life. So that is my defense of the folly of bottom and the way people go back and there is happy marriage, etc., etc., and so on. But I have digressed from the question of style. After the first scene, when everybody leaves and there is a threat given to Hermia, either marry or choose celibacy, nunnery, or even execution necessary, very, very severe punishment is. But then they leave and only Lysander and Hermia are on stage. And then they speak in rather stilted kind of language. Metaphors, images, exaggerated hyperboles, hackneyed and somewhat outmoded devices already used by the sonneteers from Italy down to England. And the effect of this, it initially might seem that Shakespeare has, made a mistake. He shouldn't have. But the lovers are doing it because they are actually expressing their kind of love through this. This is an expression of intimacy, where you use this language self-consciously. And that suggests a kind of implicit understanding between the two characters, Lysander and Hermia. Precisely the use of stilted language, acted kind of language, here is not to be taken as affectation, but rather as transparent affectation, being used as almost like kind of a joke between two lovers. So, of course, this point needs to be made repeatedly, that the play operates at various levels and registers of style. There's no doubt about that. It can be demonstrated also how from one to the other it moves and so on. And that is characteristic of Shakespeare. Now to go back to the question of dreamlike. It is one which enables you to discover your identity. Or there is nothing closed in the Renaissance conceptualization of style. Or the discovery of identity is a continuing process. But this links the Pyramus, Thisbe episode and the rude mechanicals with the life of the courtiers. When they say that they may be mistaken, they may be, people might get afraid of the effect of their plays, what will do? He says, well, I will give a prologue, etc. Bottom says that I, Pyramus, am not Pyramus, but am Bottom the weaver. This is, of course, not this, but this is the kind of identity that I'm talking about. Constant movement towards search for who you are. And then later Hermia getting up as if from a dream. If you want the exact reference, it would be Act 3, Scene 2, line 273. If you want, I can read it. If you have a little time, you can read one or two sections. Hermia saying here, cause after the confusions, etc. What? Hermia, line 271. Can you do me greater harm than hate? Hate me wherefore? O me, what news, my love? Am not I Hermia, Are not you Lysander? So this, of course, is also related to the device of disguise, which is often used in this respect. There are many meanings to disguise, of course, in Shakespeare's comedies, where women dress up like men, etc., etc. But the search for an identity is made possible by this uncertainty. That is why we need to enter into the fairyland. So the fairyland is not Arcadia or paradise before the fall of Adam. But it is an uncertain world, indefinable world, between the actual and the ideal, as I said, which enables us to come to terms with ourselves and discover that identity is a constant process. In the Renaissance texts themselves, actually, we are told, the scholars, like Boccaccio's on the genealogy of the gods, says man has two natures. He's born with a nature and he cultivates on that raw soil another nature, higher nature maybe. Of course, that means he can cultivate a lower nature, of course. And of course, everybody knows the more familiar text of Pico della Mirandola. The background to that is this, as Cassara has put it, that when we look at Renaissance philosophy, the themes and preoccupations are the same as those in medieval philosophy. Immortality, soul, etc. So what is new? What is new is, as Cassara has put it very well, that they are not talking about the existence of God, but the possibility of knowledge about the existence of God. So the transference of the focus from the object to the subject. And therefore, we are constantly, as it were, discovering ourselves. Because we are not in the midst of objective truth, we are in the midst of conditional truths. I want to finish by looking at two famous quotations, because Puck's final speech, in the end he says, "If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream." So the whole thing, the play is like a dream. And of course the most famous, well-known, but I will read it nevertheless, Tempest, "Our revels now are ended," prosperous speech. "These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air, and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." So, the insubstantiality of life. This is important because it drives home through Bottom's dream an inability to describe the dream, what I've called folly, and the need for minimal gullibility. You can't exist with a microscope in your eyes in life. Comedy, it survives, it enables us to live on the surface, but with the knowledge that under the surface there is a dangerous and dark and uncontrollable world. Only with that knowledge can we enjoy the surface, so to speak. And it's a different theme, I have not discussed this, insubstantial, dreamlike, also because this is not because of an attempt to emancipate oneself from the drive towards power. Drive towards power. Prospero's banishment was the drive to power of his brother, his own drive to power, and of course, here also we find that this is a concern with Shakespeare. And many of his plays, including tragedies, you will find very common people, common soldiers, questioning the whole ideal of gloria mundi, mundane glory and heroism. Hamlet, fine common soldier, says, why are they going? That is, the Fortinbras army has been allowed to march through for a piece of land which is worth nothing, etc. 20,000 people will die. So this is the kind of common wisdom that I was thinking of. This ability to see life from a position which is potentially emancipated from power.